Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development. With your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and with me is your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. We are excited to be here and bring you a ray of sunshine on this end to your week as you head into the weekend. So, Daniel, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. I'm happy the weather has finally picked up. It feels like spring, so lockdown doesn't seem so bad now. You can get out and try to do a couple of things. But other than that, feeling great. Happy week 6. I'm excited for week 13 when I get to say, like, this is my favorite number, week 13. Yeah, but week 6, I'm pretty happy with that.
Hey, we're just about halfway there. It is interesting. You and I experience the weather very differently. In Nashville, we are headed towards summer. It is now hot in the mid-80s and muggy, which will last until, I don't know, like October here. So, we have a different perspective there, but it is nice to be able to get outside. On the show today, our topic is user interface and user experience, UI UX to those that are in the know. And we are excited. We get to bring in another guest. We have with us today Steven Plat, who is a UI UX designer. Steven's going to help us understand the impact that UI UX has in our content and on our platforms. And kind of we'll talk through some of the theory on what makes UI UX important to the design process. I'm really excited that we're going to have this conversation, and hopefully our listeners are too. Without further delay, let's hop right into it.
Steven's been a UI UX designer at Halight for the past 2 years. So he works on the teams that Scott and I as well, and he works with us kind of week to week. Previously, he worked as a UX designer at TELUS Digital, and he's been a graphic designer at some other companies as well. He studied global business and digital arts at the University of Waterloo, where he focused on adding business value through user-centric design. I will say that one of the things at Halight we do so well is our designs. Our clients love the creative aspect of our work and what we're able to kind of communicate through design. So I'm really excited to have Steven on the show today. Steven, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We are super excited to talk to Steven today about the user interface and the user experience and sort of how you design your content. I think it's going to be just a different conversation than what we've had so far on the podcast. And I think it's something it's very front and center, obviously. It's the visual of your course. So I think as we learn a little bit more, this is going to be a really fun conversation for us. Steven, why don't we go ahead and start with like how you would define the two terms user interface and user experience? Is there a difference? What similarities in kind of the way they get applied might exist?
Yeah, sure. So user interface and user experience are two very different things, but they kind of go hand in hand very closely. So user interface ties in a lot with user experience, but not really vice versa. User experience is more of how the product works. So how you get from point A to point B, if there's different edge cases, use cases for the users. So it's really trying to understand what the user's intentions are, what they're trying to accomplish, and how are they going to get there. Whereas user interface is more of making that experience look pretty, making it look nice, adding visual cues to help guide the users along the journey that they want to accomplish, and just using a lot of visual perspective and visual cues to kind of get the point across and get the goal accomplished.
I find with just to ask a follow-up, UI UX is always UI UX. They're always tying them together. I guess my question would be, can you have one without the other? You said one ties into the other, but can you have one without the other, or do you think that you really have to, when you're looking at the holistic approach, you have to look at both?
I think you don't really get the value of each other one if you don't include both of them. If you just have a very skeleton looking design and it works really well, it might work, but you might not have the user engagement that you want to. And the same thing if you have something that's super pretty, super beautiful, looks super nice, and it just doesn't make sense, it doesn't get the goal accomplished, it's kind of useless. So I think that's kind of why they tie them together is because without the other one, it really doesn't make sense.
It's a really good kind of segue to the next question I have, which is, as you're sort of contemplating the right experience, the right visual cues, the interface, what science are you taking and applying to those designs, or are there sort of philosophies that are out there that you sort of adhere to when you're thinking those topics through?
Yeah, there's a bunch of methods and studies and different guidelines of user experience and user interface design. Specifically for user experience, there's a bunch of tests that you could do. So user testing, understanding the user, looking at data, seeing different traction rates. So where people are falling off on the website, if they're taking the training, if they're not taking the training. And this can kind of help us understand if there's gaps within the user experience. So if you think of any site that you've been to that is terrible. So if you went onto like an e-commerce site and you're trying to buy something and the experience is just horrible, chances are you're not going to do it again. And finding that UX experience can make people want to come back and make the experience much more enjoyable. So finding those best practices that allow you to do that really helps drive the experience home. As far as user interface design, there's a lot of design practices that you could do for user interface design. So specific buttons look a certain way. So say a button looks gray and kind of faded out. You kind of get the indication that that's not clickable and there's something there. Same thing for if there's an error on the screen and you want to know like what went wrong, we can kind of use user interface design to kind of describe what went wrong, what your next steps are, and where you should go from there. So it's just things like that. There's so many different like methodologies that you can go through, but just for the purpose of this high level conversation, I think assessing each element as an individual experience and seeing what the objective of that individual element is. So whether it's an error page or you're trying to get some more engagement by adding some gamified experiences, really evaluating what that is and what the goal is, you can really guide the user where the user wants to go, whether they know it or not.
You bring up a kind of a good parallel or a way of thinking of it, I think, and maybe you can describe how you apply that. You mentioned a web page or a website quite a bit there, and in many ways, when we're thinking about the way content or e-learnings are built, do you tend to apply sort of similar methodology in sort of web design to a course? I mean, in a lot of ways, they are just a version of a website. Is that something you're considering? Is some of those same concepts around things you see out in the internet and applying that to just a single digital course?
Yes and no. I think learning and development and courses are a very unique thing, but there is elements that you can kind of borrow from websites. So a major thing that we try and do as a company is make all of our courses responsive. So you can take them on a desktop or a mobile device or a tablet. A lot of that behavior comes from the way you see sites behave. Basically, every site you see online now is somewhat responsive, if not completely responsive. So a lot of those practices you can kind of take from websites, but specifically for learning and development and courses, our users are specific. We have specific users using them, whether they are required to take training or if it's elective training or they're just trying to win a prize or something, or whatever the experience is, they have a different objective than someone just going to a website to browse. And it's important to identify what that experience is and how the design revolves around that.
Yeah, I think on that note, one of the things that I think has been a common theme, and I think it kind of carries through this is the idea of the learning objectives or the overall objectives within the platform. And when it comes down to whether it's user experience based upon a course or from course or from platform, it's really about understanding what the objective of is for that learner and kind of bringing them or that user and bringing them down the path. Which I think's part of that user experience. And I think you hit it on the head when you talked about the differences between courses and platforms and where you kind of want them to navigate through.
Yeah, I think if you really think about it, like learning and development training can be super boring for some people. So design kind of helps take that perception of training being boring, I don't want to do this kind of perception to this is fun, this is engaging, this is something that I enjoy doing. And it kind of builds it's called like habit design or emotional design. So when you build a connection with a platform through whether it's gamification or just nice design or ease of use, you can really get them to want to come back and take more training. So if you're a sales employee, you're on the floor and you're busy and you have a downtime of 20 minutes, you could sit there on your phone on Twitter or take this training, learn more, get rewarded for it, get recognized for it. And creating that experience where the users want to do that is really where design kind of comes in.
Yeah, and obviously that's the goal of most L&D is how do we get people excited to participate in what we're putting out there. This may seem like a really dumb question or a simplistic question, but when we say it, we often say UI, UX, UI, UX. Is it just alphabetically? That's why it sounds better when we say that. Or when you're approaching it, do you take interface or experience as sort of your guiding principle first and apply the other? Which direction do you tend to go when evaluating? Is experience kind of your starting point or is it interface?
I like to think of it almost as a cycle. Primarily, we like to start with the experience of it. So mapping out the user journeys, figuring out what are potential flows for the user. So different scenarios of when they would be using the platform, when they would be using the courses, what the courses are intended for, things like that. And then from there, we can kind of create a wireframe of what we kind of expect it to look like based on our first interpretations of the problem and the solution that we want to offer. From there, we can kind of reassess and kind of walk through it at a high level and then take that and apply user interface design. So adding, branded colors, buttons, triggers, modals that pop up that have notifications for you to perform different actions, things like that. Assess if those are adding value or if they're just in the way. And then we can kind of cycle back to the experience of it. So once we kind of have the user interface, we can kind of cycle back and see the experience of it, see how it works, and then reassess the interface. So it kind of goes in a cycle. And then even after we're done building these products and courses, the user experience never really ends because we evaluate how they're using it, if they're using it the way we intended. Because my perception of what might be cool and exciting and engaging might not be tangible for the end user. So it's important to kind of follow the data and see if what was created is being used how we intended it to be used. And that kind of cycles back into the UX at the end.
I think the idea of it being sort of an iterative process is really helpful for anyone who's designing to not get too married to one concept until they've really had a chance to test it out. I think that's really helpful for a lot of folks that are going to be putting this to use. So with all of sort of this approach and science that exists behind the theory of how we get there, we get a lot of feedback, or you may hear a lot of people say, creative is really a subjective topic. What would be your take on that? We've tried to explain there's some objectivity or some concept that we try to apply, but is beauty really in the eye of the beholder, or is there some kind of concept that you apply to say there's a standard that we should be excelling towards?
Yeah, I think anything creative is subjective in some way. In terms of UX UI, there's definitely is best practices and guidelines and expectations and things that you kind of have to follow for accessibility reasons, or maybe just for usability, it just doesn't make sense. But the overall design is always going to be subjective. You walk into an art gallery and like what I might find appealing, you might not find that cool. So it's really trying to figure out, going off that analogy of the art gallery, it's me walking in and trying to identify what you think looks cool without you directly telling me. So I have to observe which pieces you look at directly, which ones you spend more time at, and things like that. And that's kind of how I can design in a subjective way in the eyes of the user, and then not in a subjective way of the eyes of myself.
I got a question, a follow-up on that. This is more of a fun question for you. How do you feel when you implement all your science and the things that you focus on in terms of UI, UX, and a client comes back and just makes suggestions that are just off the wall and just make no sense?
Yeah, that definitely
happened. Oh yeah, no.
That definitely happens sometimes. But yeah, so in that perspective, there's a lot of subjective feedback that comes back from the client without knowledge in the reason why things are a certain way, and that's where my job kind of comes in to kind of prove the reason why one way might be better than the other. I guess it is subjective in that sense, but the client might not always understand what the end user is trying to accomplish. They might just be looking at it from a corporate perspective, trying to do like meet numbers or design what they think is best for their company. When in actuality, the training is meant for their end users, and if they don't fully understand what the objectives of their end users are, they might not provide the right feedback that pertains to the best interest of those users.
I think keeping audience first and top of mind is probably really important, but can get lost in that conversation with a lot of clients. I also feel like Steven might have had trouble answering that a little bit because I'm usually the one asking him to do things, and he probably doesn't like my designs. But there we go.
No, and that's the thing. I think that we are, our relationship as a service provider. Halight is always interesting because really, when it comes down to it, we serve a customer, right? But our actual audience is not the customer we're serving. So, whether it's a client of ours who needs a platform or needs a bunch of e-learning built, we're designing to adhere to the needs and objectives of the learner, not of our client. And sometimes those things don't line up. If the education, I think that Steve, just in my working with you, you do a great job of explaining and providing expertise to our client base about why design now. But I think we do a great job of being that expert and kind of trying to explain why and how. That's good.
Yeah, for sure. And I think feedback is exactly what it is. It's feedback, right? So just because it's feedback doesn't mean it's the right answer. And it might just be, I always look at feedback as the opportunity to drive more conversation. If someone is perceiving something I designed in a different way, what does this button do? Why is this here? It doesn't make sense. Then that means that person has a different perception of what that button's doing than I did in my head. So if that one person is having that perception, there could be thousands of other people that have the exact same thing. That doesn't mean that person's right. It doesn't mean I'm right. It just means that we need to reevaluate the situation and reevaluate the design and understand why that confusion is happening and what the solution is to make it not confusing.
So when we talk about UI and UX, obviously I think we've landed a lot of sort of how we get to the right experience. How are we evaluating the right interface? Is it meeting the needs of the learner and keeping the audience top of mind? But from a content perspective, when we look at the trainings we're putting out there, what would you say UI UX plays in terms of a role as a differentiator between mediocre content, good content, great content? Like, where can UI UX really help a company or an organization raise that bar on their content quality?
I think design plays a huge role in pushing the content to the next level. I kind of circle back to my point of where training is stereotypically boring. I think adding that design element keeps it interesting, especially if you have training that has to happen every year, every quarter. Keeping it interesting and engaging and different and involved, it really allows people to retain the information much better when it's not just a bunch of text on a screen. I know I'm guilty of it doing training for previous jobs where I just hit the play button, go do something, come back, and then wait for it to finish. By adding that design element to it, it adds engagement, which does wonders to retaining information. Everyone's a different type of learner, whether you're auditory, visual, whatever it may be, and in creating those design elements that kind of incorporate all those learning channels can really not only make the content interesting, but make it stick.
When you as you talk through some of you mentioned things like these quarterly or biannual or annual courses that are coming up on a kind of a rhythm, right? We probably all have taken HR content or compliance content that often comes up over and over again. Do you have a perception on how much of that should stay consistent and static from a UI UX versus how much do you want to try to re-energize the audience by introducing something new or keeping it fresh? Is there a balance there that you like to keep, or is there guidelines you tend to kind of adhere to saying we want it to still feel familiar, we want it to still feel like a consistent brand or theme versus trying to not have it feel stale? Is there a balance there for you?
I think there is a balance. Obviously, we're not going to do a custom design for every single piece of content, but the overall, I worry for people that get into this cycle of reusing the same piece of content for 5 years in a row. That gets very boring very fast. I think that the healthy balance is just keeping up to date every so often, and just re-uploading new designs.
With that, what steps do you think a organization that maybe has not focused on UI UX historically, they've either just sort of made static or kind of stark content, white background, black text, just a PowerPoint presentation style delivery without a lot of thought and design around that? What are sort of the steps that get you into the UI UX experience and trying to think about that more holistically in your design approach that most organizations might benefit from?
I think the biggest thing is having someone on your team to just think freely and think creatively, to kind of think without any boundaries. And by doing that, you can get these really crazy ideas that are really cool and really exciting. And then by doing that, you can kind of see what you're capable of and then reel it in from there. If you start at your what's realistic and work outwards, it's really hard to get out of that bubble. So I think doing the reverse and kind of thinking big, thinking creative, thinking freely, just go wild with it, and then reeling that in and seeing what's realistic from that, you'll get some really cool ideas and realistic ideas that are creative.
I think that's an area we're all living in right now when we are experiencing sort of our work and our balance from an organization perspective is we're all kind of having to take some new thoughts and think a little differently than we have in the past. And I like that approach to be able to think wild and think crazy a little bit and then see where that actually lines up with reality and logistically capable components. So, Steven, I want to say thank you. This has been really enlightening and I think really helpful and given us a lot to talk about as the podcast continues. And it's definitely a fresh opinion that I don't think it's talked about enough when we talk about the way we're going to design and develop content. So really appreciate your insights and your comments today. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steven.
That was definitely a different topic for us. We haven't spent a lot of time on anything in that arena. But I like that we wrapped up by reminding teams that it's important to think big and have a new hope around creativity and content and platforms. So, Daniel, obviously we want to continue the conversation. What was something you took away from the interview that you think we should spend a little bit more time and dig in on?
I think Steven touched on how creative is subjective, but it can also be a variable. So when someone lands on a piece of content or a website or a learning management system or a platform that has been developed, you have the opportunity to create brand affinity between yourself as the brand and your audience right away. So the first impression that creative can leave as from the user interface perspective is so important to the overall experience within the platform. You think about the cliche, pictures worth 1,000 words. It really can help build enthusiasm, allow people to be excited about being on the platform, navigate them through the platform the way you want. So I think the first impression that you leave with your creative is a huge component to anything you're designing and putting out to your audience.
I think it's also, when we think about most organizations, they spend a ton of time on whether it's their brand logo or their word mark or just their general mission and vision statements. We spend a lot of time branding the company itself. And to your point, not only is it your first impression, but it's also your long-standing impression. Do people identify your content or your platform with a certain feel, a look that resonates with your company? And they, again, to your point, brand affinity, they start to recognize that, they can see it up front. And will they automatically kind of go, oh, that's company X's content or a company X's platform for a long term? And they'll feel more inclined to engage with that on a long-term basis.
I think it's like you said, the marketing departments and branding teams of all these organizations spend so much time making sure that they have their mission, their vision, their core values as a company, but that their branding speaks that language, and you get that feeling when you interact with their brand at all. And one of the things that we spend so much time on, and Steven and the team, the UX team, is so good at, is making sure that our platforms, our content feel synonymous with the brand that we're working with, and they don't feel like an extension. It feels part of it, and that's a huge part. I think of just our day to day of how we can build brand affinity and set first impressions.
If I was going to pick part of the interview out that I thought was really great, was Steven spent a lot of time talking around an organization's ability to feel a bit nimble, obviously, in what they're doing. But you ultimately need to kind of go with a plan, and that plan often requires you to think about the iterative process that is UI UX design. So I think thinking ahead and go ahead and lay a plan out, you'll be able to think about starting with kind of user experience, then user interface, but needing to review that. And you may need to come back to the user experience. If you're getting feedback from your client or your partner saying, I didn't understand this or I didn't understand that, you're going to need to go back, evaluate, change, and then come back at it again and go through that process a few times. I like that because it speaks very much to our general learning process for building out content. We often follow the ADDIE process, right? We're going to do some design, we're going to do some development, we're going to implement that, might just be through testing or feedback, but then we're going to evaluate, we're going to start over and kind of going through to make sure we really get that to speak the right language, meet the right objectives, and continually develop that process so we're refining it and getting exactly what we need out of our content. But that applies just as much to a platform or the look and the feel of a course as well.
I think that what's unique about how user interface and user experience interact with each other, and Steven alluded to this, is that it's not necessarily that one comes before the other, although you typically start and kind of frame up user experience, then you design it, and then you revise it. But it's really it's a circle. It's almost what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I mean, it's let's review it, let's see how everybody feels, and at the end of the day, whoever is navigating your content, navigating your platform, they're the ones who decide what the user experience is going to be like. You can try to set them down a path, but when you look at data afterwards, you really start to learn, and you'll find out where they want to head down, what path they want to go on. What you may wanted to lead them down a garden path, but they may stepped over the bushes and went on a different path themselves. So it's that iterative process you mentioned to analyze and go back and forth and make sure that you land on something that all different types of learners are going to be able to engage with. On that note, I mentioned through that there is an analysis process and a back and forth, and one of the things about design in general, now this is not technically user interface, but just design, it can be pictures, it can be whatever, and I know that our creative team at Halight is cringing as I'm about to have this conversation, but I am so a true believer that creative is subjective in nature. Everybody has a different opinion. Steven talked about the different types of learners, and that's probably where it comes from, of people who, just appeal to content differently. I made a joke. Everybody, when I had my baby 12 weeks ago, everybody said like, well, she looks like your wife. She looks like basically your wife. She doesn't look like me at all, but I'm not someone who looks at a baby and I'm like, yeah, that person's got that person's nose. I just can't do that. Right. Where some people make comments like that. And I'm comparing creative to a baby, but that's a whole thing, but everybody sees something differently. Everybody's going to see something differently in an image, differently in a person. So when it comes to, there's a subjective nature in everything we're looking at, and that opinion and subjective nature leads to conversation, which is the back and forth that you were just alluding to. Evaluation of something leads to perspective and allows us to understand what we want the content to really look like.
Yeah, one of the things that, as you and I started kind of working together, that you sort of taught me on the creative side of things was you can't get too married to your design or get too involved up front and try to refine it too much to get to be just the way you want it to be, or just try to kind of you can get stuck in a place where you're tweaking way too often. The best thing to do, and I've learned this, thank you for the lesson, because I do take it to heart frequently, is get that creative content out Have it meet your standards, obviously, up front. But once it does, get that out into the world with your partners and your clients. Let them see it and provide that feedback, because your perception could be completely off to what they like. And you don't know that until you're going to get that feedback. You can spend a lot of time revising and tweaking in your own kind of solo environment and not understand what the world around you is going to give. And then you've wasted that time, and when you're not doing it. Invite that feedback, get that conversation, get that loop going, so that you can tweak it so that everyone has insight and perspective, and you're kind of evaluating within that sphere. I think that really helps.
Yeah, I think it taps into, I think, a lot of things just in life in general. Like, you don't get to decide anything. The market as a whole always decides, right? So we release content, our clients put things out into the world, and they think it's great. Yes, this video is gonna do great on YouTube, and then it doesn't, and then, or this video is not gonna do so well, and then it goes viral. And I think that's the same thing with design as a whole. It's the same thing with content. You write articles, you read books, whatever it is. The market gets to decide what's good and what's not. So you need to set a standard, like you mentioned, and then let the market decide, and then you can tweak after the fact, right? You can. I think it goes back to some objective-based, KPI-based conversations that we've had during past weeks. When you're evaluating the KPIs in your platform or in your training, understand how data speaks to that. Okay, we have a drop-off rate 75% through, or people aren't going to these pages on our site or our platform. How can we revise to get people there? How can we realign our objectives to redesign? So getting yourself up to that standard, and then allowing the market to decide, and then tweaking after the fact is a big, I think, to getting successful UI UX. Tweaking after the fact is a huge part of the game.
I love any conversation that takes us directly into data and analysis at the end of it all to get better. So I'm all for it in that sense.
I'll send you a spreadsheet after the call, Scott.
I like it. I'll just go play with it. That's fine. It doesn't even have to say anything. We talked in the interview around the fine line, though, that is subjective versus known theory and philosophy that you also have to apply. When you're talking about creative design and content like this, your organization might see you as a rebel, or that you're going rogue and trying to come up with some new creative ideas. And while I don't want you to just feel like you have to clone ideas, there are also certain kind of set symbols and elements in the world that are known to people. And we also don't want to just creatively change those around. So subjectivity goes out the window a bit in certain topics. And there was a class I took in college called Heuristics and Design for Platforms. And I found it really interesting because a lot of times you don't know it. It's very subtle in what these elements are in the world that you just automatically recognize. A few examples that we don't think about but have been ingrained in us, and we all would recognize them, are things like the crosswalk symbol. When you're in a busy city street or whatever, and you get that crosswalk, you instinctively, without having to really be told, know what the little white man walking means. That means I can go, or the red hand standing up in your face is a stop. We don't have to think about those things. The other one that is my absolute favorite in design is the save button on almost any piece of software that you're used to using. It's a floppy disk, but if you asked my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old why that picture, they can tell you it means that that's the save button, but they have no concept of what a floppy disk is, because it's become antiquated technology. But because it's so ingrained in the environment, you don't want to change that. No UI UX is going to say, well, it's really old, we shouldn't use that anymore, because people know it. And so I think when you're doing design like that, there is a lot of creativity and subjectivity that can go into the design and the interface. But maybe that UX component is maybe more rooted in consistency and constants that have to be a part of that. The reality is you're going to try to figure out where that balance is for your organization. You don't want to try to force anything that doesn't really work. And I think that ultimately is part of that balancing act that every team has to kind of go through when you're figuring out what's subjective versus what needs to be objective in your design, so you don't lose some of your purpose.
Yeah, I think that sometimes in those conversations, and I'm going to throw one that I love, because I know this comes up with client conversations when we talk about mobile design. I'll call it the hamburger, but basically the menu icon, right? Some people will say, like, I don't know, what is that? And like, it's in every app. Everybody knows what that is. And they may not, consciously know, but if they're looking for the menu in an app or a mobile design, that's typically where they will head. And part of that, I think, is sometimes the content, when we talk to customers or we deal with people who develop their own content, sometimes the writing and the content, they feel can overweigh the need for design. But for all those things that you outline, like it's important to make sure that you're tapping into the necessary creative resources to make sure that you can basically, you can give a good first impression. You can hit on different types of learning with the design and get your content across. I think that the content, yes, is the most important, but the creative side is going to help people get through whatever they're learning and enjoy that experience. So I think it's really important to take those elements and the science behind it and make sure that there is a conscious creative element in everything you're putting out there.
Well, I think that's this was a conversation that I really enjoyed having. I think it's different than where we've spent a lot of our time in terms of content development. But I think that's a great place for us to kind of wrap up the interview with Steven. Again, we want to say thank you to him for all of his time and helping us along the conversation. And if you have any additional thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. But let's move on to our next segment.
Come on, get happy.
All right, every week we are looking for the positive moment that we are experiencing, something that inspires us. And I don't think I am probably letting you in on anything that is trade secret, but we do record the podcast a few days before we release it out into the world. So today is Star Wars Day, and it is one of my favorite holidays of the year, official or not, recognized by the world, I'm not sure. But I do love Star Wars Day, so hopefully throughout the podcast you have picked up on some subtle and maybe some not so subtle terrible Star Wars dad puns and trying to drop those in. If you didn't, I encourage you to go back and listen and count. I did not keep track, so I can't tell you how many are there. But I like Star Wars Day. I am a big nerd. It gives me a chance to publicly acknowledge that in the world, celebrate my nerdiness. I have brought my children along into this world, whether they like it or not, they get to play along. So it is a small amount of joy for me. I love the sales, the deals that I can browse online and find reasons to buy things that I absolutely have no reason to own, but I get to do it for a couple of days every year without too much judgment from my wife. So for me, that's always a fun part of the week for me is May the 4th. So Daniel, what's going on in your world?
I'm excited about this week. We talk about holidays. I think this holiday might be a little bit more official than Star Wars Day, Scott, but it's a first in our household. But this week is Mother's Day. I'm a mama's boy, self-admittedly. So it's always a nice time to show appreciation to my mom. Not that I don't do it every day, by the way. But in this household, obviously, I'm excited for my wife. Obviously, I've mentioned multiple times that we have a 12-week-old daughter. She's 12 weeks old now. But I'm excited for this week. It's a really positive. It's spring. I'm excited to potentially get outside for a barbecue. It's kind of that first weekend of the year where you can start experiencing, people are gardening. It's this positive time of the year. And it starts off with the most important person in the world, which is your mom. And I'm excited for my wife to have her first Mother's Day and get to, spoil her a little bit on Sunday. So I'm excited for this weekend.
Absolutely. And happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there who are, whether it's your first or many of them to count, we appreciate everything you're doing for us. The reality is none of us would be here or the people we are without our moms. So happy Mother's Day. All right. Well, that will do it for us today. Thanks again. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonca, and may the 4th be with you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing podcast@halight.com or on social media platforms at Halight Inc. And be sure to check us out on the web at www.halight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.